Chapter 1. Reincarnation. MC's POV. To my knowledge, a child should not have proper eyesight for quite a while after being born. However, what I was experiencing made me doubt logic and what I knew. In front of my vision, rather clearly, was the face of a beautiful blonde woman around 20 years old. Her face was wet with sweat and her hair disheveled, and she looked down at me with a gentle smile. Beside her stood a man of a similarly young age with light brown hair, giving me a stiff smile. He was a handsome and muscular young man. His physique was amazing. At one point, the man stuck out his tongue and started making silly and goofy expressions toward me, at which I slightly twitched out of awkwardness. Hash 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 hash. The people around me talked to each other, but to me it only sounded like unintelligible gibberish. I tried to move, but it was fruitless. I felt various sensations coming from my body, but I could not properly control my movements. Where am I? I tried to speak, but only some strange sounds escaped my strangely responsive mouth. Soon enough, the woman lifted me up with her hands and brought me closer as she looked down at me with an endearing smile. The two people around me continued talking. Is this a joke? I really don't feel like I'm dreaming, my heart thought. To not feel like a fool, I consciously tried to do a reality check by willing myself to fly up, to see if I was not dreaming. However, as I continued at it for a few seconds, it failed. In that case, could it mean that I reincarnated? At that moment the man took me over from the woman's hands and then shot me up into the air while saying, Hey, man, what the hell are you doing? So irresponsible. I'm an infant that was just born. Is this Sparta? Zenith and Paul POV. Paul picked his just-born son, then with a smile proceeded to throw him up into the air and down while cheerfully saying, Don't do that. Be careful. He's just a baby. Zenith chided him harshly at this. Paul grinned. Haha. He'll be fine. He's my son. Zenith formed a wry smile and did not know whether to laugh or cry. Their son has just been born. He was not even a toddler. How could her husband be so thoughtless? However, she was overwhelmed with happiness too much to complain. Paul was just like that, sometimes quite silly. She simply smiled and dropped the topic when she saw that the baby didn't cry and her husband also stopped his reckless behavior. After taking another good look at the baby in Zenith's hands, Paul flirtatiously smiled at her and said, It looks like he took after you. He has both your hair and your beautiful blue eyes. Zenith formed a gentle smile. Raising up the boy in his own hands, Paul continued enthusiastically, How do we name him then? What about Rudeus? Zenith wryly smiled and said, Since the moment I saw him, I thought of the name Seraphim. After all, he has such pretty light blonde hair and bright blue eyes. What do you think, dear? Seraphim. Paul hesitated. After a good while, he finally nodded his head. Well, all right. Paul wanted to name his son Rudeus, for short Rudy, after an old friend of his. Rud, his good friend from the slums who had given him a place to stay after he first left the Nodo's family. In addition, in the beast god language Rudy also means ginger. He heard it from Ghislaine before, because his light brown hair could also be called ginger. Paul thought that he was quite smart with his naming sense, but as Zenith said, Seraphim was more fitting given the boy's appearance. He felt that he can use the name, Rudeus, in the future, since Paul certainly would not stop with just one kid. MC's POV. A while later. Short and chubby baby arms, the inability to control my body and hands, and to speak properly. I was a little cold as well, and my body seemed fragile. Also, two strangely giant adults looking down at me with loving smiles while talking in a completely foreign language as I laid down on a seemingly spacious bed. It did not take long for me to come to the conclusion that I had reincarnated. A normal person might not have come to this conclusion so easily, but fortunately or unfortunately my weeb level was high enough that it was instead the first thing I thought of. After all, I thought of this because I wanted it to be correct. And that's because, if I really did reincarnate to another world that might have different rules and physics, something like a fantasy world with magic, then I might be able to strive toward the impossible and fantastical dream of striving to attain immortality and godlike powers. I was not interested in these things because I had some kind of god complex or wanted to live forever, but simply because after the various experiences and realizations that I came to throughout my life, I became exceedingly bored and disappointed with my life on Earth. I felt that living while pursuing these grand and majestic targets in a world filled with dangers would be the most interesting, fun and meaningful way to live a life. Only something like this could make my life interesting and full of meaning again. Of course, the fact that in a fantasy world there are usually also fantastical beauties, adventures and the strong or revered was an appreciated bonus. Totally not the main reason though. Putting jokes aside, my heart naturally also longed to experience passionate romances and love with interesting and wonderful women in a fantastical world with dangers all around, even if I would not outwardly admit it. At this moment, I thought of acting more like a newborn baby. Gah, 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 given that I was a child, I started wiggling my limbs around and let out some sounds. That's what a newborn baby should do, right? I have already kind of dropped the thought that I was reborn in Sparta and that babies that don't look healthy will be thrown off a cliff like Simba, but it still remained at the back of my mind. I still didn't want to be seen as a strange or mentally handicapped child. In turn, it seemed that what I did made me be noticed because the beautiful blonde woman picked me up again with a soft smile and then brought me closer to her chest. I was preoccupied with thinking of the consequences of my situation to properly register the situation around me, but I had to secretly admit that my mother's twin peaks were quite spectacular. The moment the woman brought me closer, my hands followed a strange instinct and started grasping anything in sight. And what was the closest in sight was the woman's chest. Involuntarily, my hands grasped the cloth that held up the blonde woman's breasts and started gripping and caressing that area. I felt so weird. It wasn't like me. It isn't like I can't keep my hands to myself. And it isn't like I even wanted to do this. This has already happened when I was picked up earlier. I guess it is just a newborn baby's reflex to grasp things. Yeah, I swear I'm not a pervert. At least, not to this extent. At this moment, the woman seemed not to mind anything and softly said something. After that, she revealed one of her breasts and gently brought my face closer to it. I instantly felt a little awkward. Right. I'm supposed to suck now. Being treated as a child by a beautiful and sexy woman, made to drink her baby milk. It was an extremely embarrassing situation. However, I knew at the back of my mind that if I wanted to follow through with my ambitions, I needed to grow up with a strong body. Thinking of it, when I was still growing up during my previous life, I often skipped entire nights of sleep by gaming, sleeping very little and eating whatever. It was only later in life that I switched to having a healthy diet and proper sleeping schedule, but the damage was already done. I didn't grow up as tall and strong as I could have otherwise. In this life, I didn't want to have a below average height and a weak body again. I had to eat as much as possible, and give my growing body all the nutrients it needed. Reincarnated protagonists that refuse to drink milk until they finally get a bottle. Weaklings. Forcefully ignoring my feelings of shame, I slightly gulped and then latched onto the nipple of my mother with my mouth. Before I knew it, my mouth started sucking the protrusion on my assumed mother's bosom as if by instinct. At first, nothing happened as I sucked in vain. But soon after trying hard for a short while, I finally felt a thick liquid enter my mouth. I didn't expect much and simply focused on acquiring nutrients. However, it wasn't bad. Should I say it was a bit salty? Either way, perhaps to my baby taste buds, it was quite good. After seeing that the milk was not strange tasting as I expected, but surprisingly good, I began sucking at it with double vigor while enduring this humiliation. It was all to grow up strong. I had such plans, to eat as much as possible. But before even a minute passed, I suddenly felt full already. Just the idea of eating any more than that made me nauseous. It seemed that a newborn baby's stomach and needs are smaller than I thought. I felt that it was time to stop, so I stopped sucking and pulled back my head. After that I simply started moving my hands around while being held closely by the woman. I didn't even need to force myself to fake doing random baby actions, as I only needed to follow this body's instinct. As the woman noticed that I was finished, she hid her breast, then brought me closer and started hugging me with love while slowly swinging and caressing me. What I felt at that moment was once again embarrassment. I was neither used to this kind of familial love nor to being treated as a baby. Whether from embarrassment or something else as well, my heart felt warm. But regardless of anything, it was impossible for me to resist and I also had my role to play as a baby. As such, I simply stayed in my mother's arms as I let my hands wander aimlessly and squeeze her fingers. In the meantime my mind wandered as well. Paul and Zenith. I thought of these two names. The two I just saw were not drawn 2D anime characters, but real people. Although the features somewhat matched, immediately assuming that these two were characters from an anime show that I watched before would be jumping the gun. I could not understand any of the words that the people around me were saying. It all sounded like gibberish and blended together into an unrecognizable whole. However, among the many foreign words that made no sense to me, I noted the man saying the word, Zenith, a few times when addressing the blonde women. Then, after witnessing a bespectacled maid wrap a soft towel around me as she placed me in a wooden cradle, I felt quite convinced. Did I reincarnate in the world of Mushoku Tensei? After I came to the realization that I was very likely in a real world of swords and magic, I did not want to waste any more time. Magic. Could I use it? It is often in fantasy that without learning magic, you can't use it, even if you have the talent for it. But there are also those fantasy worlds in which all you need to do is use your mind and the reality would be bent to your will. Otherwise, it is sometimes at least possible to exercise simple magic control and interact with the world's special energy, even if nothing special happens in the outside world. Since it's likely that I'm in the body of Rudeus and have inherited the Laplace factor, that much might not be impossible. I quickly thought of trying out a simple meditation exercise. As I calmed down my mind and focused all of my attention on my breath to enter a tranquil state, I concentrated and focused my entire being on absorbing outside energy into my body. In Mushoku Tensei, that energy should probably be mana, but I tried to keep my mind open to not limit myself. I had no idea if any of this would work, but I wanted to try anything. This was simply the first thing I thought of. After all, while being stranded in my cradle, I could do nothing else but this, use my mind. As I began mindfully meditating, a minute passed. Then several, but I still didn't experience anything unexpected. Soon enough, my parents and the maid left me. I guess they thought I fell asleep. I continued my meditation practice. I continued guiding my breath through my body while supplementing it by imagining the absorbed world's energy strengthening me. Unaware if it should be energy that came with my breath, or energy that I would absorb from the atmosphere through my skin, I exercised my imagination and tried anything. However, time passed and there was no result. To be honest, I was quite tired from the moment I came to this world. Soon enough, I was unable to ignore the rising exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me and eventually my consciousness drifted off to sleep. 52 comments 0 vote. Chapter 2. Manipulating Pure Mana, Growing Mana Pool. After waking up, I quickly realized my situation as I noted my strange and unresponsive new body, and felt a warm and rather unpleasant sensation around my butt crack. Right, I reincarnated. And now something sticky and wet was glued to my butt. Oh poop. Having realized that, I felt both uncomfortable and a little disgusted. What now? Should I cry out loud, so someone comes and cleans it up? However, the surroundings were completely dark. At a glance, it was the middle of the night. If I started crying loudly, I would definitely wake up my parents and make them feel annoyed. But of course, crying was something that a normal baby would. It was only natural. After thinking about it for a while, I soon ignored the matter for the time being as I instead excitedly focused on my special meditation practice once again. When I woke up, I had an idea that I wanted to try. I remember it clearly. Starting to practice with magic while you're still very young is the key to building up extraordinarily large mana capacity in Mushoku Tensei. Coincidentally, I started rereading the Mushoku Tensei web novel, so the early volumes were still rather fresh in my mind. To my knowledge, it seemed that to grow my mana pool, all that I needed to do was to simply exhaust my mana as often as possible during youth. Every time my mana recovers back to full, my mana capacity would increase. Anyone can grow their mana pool, as long as they start practicing from a young age. In contrast, there was never an instance in the original show where someone meditated in order to restore their mana or battle aura, or meditated to improve these. If I'm the same as a normal person, then meditating in the manner I did earlier would have no special effects. What Rudeus did to increase his mana reserves was simply daily using up his mana on spells. That was it. No special magic training method or magical theory should be needed to grow a person's mana pool, just the act of regularly exhausting your mana. However, even though I knew this, I still had no idea how to even get started with using up my mana or performing magic. After all, I didn't even have even the most basic knowledge on magic and didn't know any spells or incantations. As such, in the end my only option was trying to use my imagination again. First, I simply tried to feel out my body and send out my mana into the outside world. Instead of absorbing energy into my body like earlier, I would try expelling it outwards. I closed my eyes, concentrated my mind, tried to get attuned with my entire body and then focused on expelling my mana out into the atmosphere. Minute by minute passed as I kept practicing and experimenting with focus. First I tried my meditation exercise while focusing on my breath again, focusing on exhalation, before I tried to rely on pure imagination, and then finally imagined energy flowing through imaginary pathways running through my body like wires. Eventually, as I focused on my heart being the vocal point, I felt something. There was a change. I had a faint feeling of something warm traveling along my veins, flowing from my toes, the top of my head and my entire body all the way to my right hand, akin to blood coursing through my blood vessels. Energy gathered in my right hand, at the tip of my index finger. And then my body started letting out something through my fingertip. It wasn't really quite the same, but it was similar to letting out my breath through a new mysterious organ. Yes. I did it. I felt incredibly excited when I felt this mysterious and magical sensation. Keep it. Maintain it. I kept up my concentration and continued sending out my special energy through my fingertip. However, after just a dozen seconds passed like this, I felt increasingly tired. A moment later, I was so exhausted I fell asleep before I knew it. A month passed by. Following my discovery that I'm able to expel special energy by focusing on it, I continued doing it and exhausting my reserves whenever I was awake. The fact that the energy I manipulated felt warm and flowed along my veins threw me off at first, but then I recalled that Rudeus made a similar comparison. As such, my assumption is that this energy is simply mana. The pathways inside my body should be something like magic circuits, which coincidentally overlap with my blood vessels. Meanwhile, what I was doing was in essence pure mana manipulation. Fortunately, it was possible for me to manipulate pure mana and send it outwards, even though I had no knowledge of magic theory and didn't know any spells. It reminded me of the time when Rudeus practically self-learned disrupt magic, which seemed to work at a similar principle, pure mana manipulation. To my knowledge of this world, the fact that I was incredibly young and prone to learning new things should also play a factor in helping with my affinity for magic. During the first time I did the exercise, I completely ran out of mana after only a dozen seconds. Afterwards, the time I needed to expel all of my mana and the mana's volume slowly increased significantly and exponentially with every time I did it. Fortunately, the volume of mana that I was able to consciously expel per second was also gradually improving during my practice, so my method remained viable. If at first my flow of mana was just like a tiny and feeble stream slowly dropping from a faucet, then after a month of practice it was similar to water gushing out from a water hose. This kind of progress made me feel extremely satisfied and excited. Both my mana reserves and my ability to control mana should be rapidly improving. And most importantly, I began this kind of training just a few hours after I came out of the womb. If I recall the novel correctly, Rudeus only began practicing magic and working on his mana reserves when he was 2 years old. Beginning 2 years earlier would certainly give me an advantage. Not only this, but a newborn baby's constitution should be even more prone to changes and improvements than that of a 2-year-old child. My secret hope was that by starting my practice so early, I would be able to break through my possible limitations and enhance my potential even further like no one ever had before. As a reincarnator, I obviously wish that I was born with an overpowered talent as well, like it usually is in fiction. There was a high possibility that the body that I inherited had a powerful Laplace factor, hence it was chosen as the vessel for my soul in the first place. This is what happened to Rudeus after all. But of course, as someone who read Reverend Insanity and Zero, I knew to not blindly believe in the notion that I'm destined for greatness either. It's possible that I was able to grasp the pure mana manipulation method so quickly only thanks to the fact that I'm a newly born child with a flexible mind and body. And the younger you are, the easier learning magic is to learn in this world. I had no memories of my death or how I came to this world, so that didn't help either. But because my grade of talent was unknown, it only made me determined to keep training even harder and with more focus to make the most out of what I was given. The first time I exhausted my mana, I fainted, but afterwards I didn't go as far. Then while I was out of mana and awake, I would always spend my time mindfully meditating to train my mind. After all, even without any special effects, meditation might still have a strong positive effect on my developing brain. It was proven to even have benefits on adults, so what to say about a baby that was just born? And especially so in a world of swords and magic. As a baby I could do nothing else but to use my mind anyway. Several times I attempted using my mana to do something substantial in the outside world like forming a gust of wind, creating a blob of water or pushing away a toy with telekinesis. Unfortunately, all my attempts were unsuccessful. I was able to manipulate pure mana and expel it when I put my mind to it, but I couldn't make it affect reality. I tried to make my mana flow through my body in a circuit like chakra or something similar, but it was not possible either, I could only expel it outwards. Being very careful about it, I also faintly attempted to compress mana inside my heart, but it didn't seem to do anything. In fact, trying to apply mana to any part of my body didn't seem to do anything as if mana itself had effect on humans. However, since I was still able to exhaust my MP just through this method, I didn't waste much of my time on trying things that bore no results and that I didn't need yet. My daily routine usually looked something like this: wake up, cry out to be cleaned up and be fed baby milk, expel my mana and then mindfully meditate until I naturally fall asleep. Then I would wake up and repeat the cycle. Again and again. As I expelled my mana outwards, it didn't cause any phenomenon in the outside world. There were no shining lights or anything. Pure mana seemed to be colorless, formless and invisible. Because of this I still remained undiscovered. During this time I also discovered that I can release mana through both of my hands instead of just one. Doing this increased my efficiency by almost half. Unfortunately, it was not a double increase, but it was still an improvement as I utilized both of my arms instead of just one. I didn't need any training to do that, so I think it's a natural ability of any magician. I imagined a magician holding a staff with both hands for that. However, it should not mean that I can cast two different spells at the time. It's only about channeling mana through both arms. As I continued experimenting, I also discovered that I'm able to release mana through my feet, mouth, other body parts, and even from my entire body simultaneously. However, using any other body part apart from my hands was significantly less efficient. Even if I try to send mana out through all the pores in my body, it is not as good as focusing on pouring it out through my hands. This led me to believe that the magic circuits in a human body were probably designed in this way, for the magic to be mainly released through one's hands. It's like a one-directional highway leading to a destination, the destination being a person's hands. The rest of the body, like feet, could be used to channel mana through them as well, but it is not the best method, like driving against the traffic. Putting aside my training, during the last month I became slightly more familiar with the world around me. The couple that I saw when I first opened my eyes were obviously my parents, both in their early 20s and both with great looks. My mother's name was Zenith, for sure. We had a single maid in the house, wearing maid's clothing. Her name was confirmed to be Lilia, as it's what Zenith called her. My father's name was not confirmed yet, but who else could it be but everyone's favorite, Paul? The place I lived in itself was a room of a wooden medieval-style building. There were no signs of modern technology anywhere. Lilia cleaned with a cloth, whereas the utensils, bowls and furniture were clearly made from wood. The light was not produced by light bulbs, but came from candles and lamps. My parents' clothes looked like those of a medieval villager from a fantasy world. At the same time, I realized that people did not call me Rudy, as I expected. It didn't seem that my name was Rudeus. Instead, my parents were addressing me as Seraph. In addition to this, I once looked into a mirror and saw my appearance: short spare blonde hair, like a baby would have, and blue eyes were my characteristic features. Looks-wise I took more after Zenith than Paul. Initially I assumed that I had taken Rudeus's place, so I was very surprised by this. I seemed to be the first child and only child. In this world, Seraph was born instead of Rudeus. It seemed that this world was a little different. Hopefully, the changes only extended to myself. And hopefully, I was talented in magic just like Rudeus was. And ideally also the sword, unlike Rudeus. But while I dreamed of training to wield a sword and slash dragons in half, my current challenge was being able to control my bladder and bowel movements, which was frankly impossible. While some people might find it comforting that they can just lay in bed, shit themselves and someone would even clean up after them, for me it was a torture. Being a baby sucks. However, thanks to starting as a baby I had a chance to train and greatly improve my condition, unlike those people in fiction who reincarnate as teenagers or adults, so I did not complain. The thing that allowed me to bravely persevere was my desire to grow stronger. As well as the wish to one day meet the wonderful and interesting heroines that I only knew from the story before, I'll be honest. Note: an explanation on what Laplace factor is, stemming from my research of various original sources. At least, this is my interpretation and also logic I use in this story for things to make sense. A person with the so-called Laplace factor is practically someone born with some of the genes of the big evil overlord called demon god Laplace, who was known as an incredibly powerful magic user. In the case of Rudeus in the original novel, his Laplace factor manifests in the form of his great talent for magic and unmatched mana capacity potential. His Laplace factor is also said by the author to be the reason why Rudeus cannot use battle aura, because Laplace was also unable to use it. Because the Laplace factor practically functions as genes, there are different kinds of factors, and they have different intensity. Depending on which ones a person manifests, it could grant great mana capacity, what Rudeus has, and what Sylphie also has in a weaker version, powerful physical body, what Rudeus's son gets green hair, what Sylphie and her son has no talent for battle aura, what Rudeus has, it seems, and Laplace's demon eyes probably. These are randomly manifested. There is no such thing as mana capacity talent Laplace factor trading battle aura for more mana. Sounds silly, doesn't it? Or the mana capacity Laplace factor being confirmed to make someone unable to use battle aura, but it is possible to simply inherit a Laplace factor that's detrimental and makes you unable to use battle aura, aka Laplace's gene for being unable to use battle aura. 95% of the population can't use battle aura very effectively anyway, by the way. A talent for magic and no battle aura is simply a genetic hand that Rudeus was dealt in the original, as we can view it, probably so he wouldn't become too OP as a main character and struggle as a pure magician. The protagonist in my fanfiction inherited the magic talent mana pool. Laplace factor is the only factor, so he is not stopped from being able to progress as a swordsman as well. By relation, it also allows him to use silent healing magic which Rudeus could not do. I believe it's better to be transparent here, even if it is a spoiler. Seraph did not receive any wishes or cheats. What he has over Rudeus is not receiving a nerf to his battle aura. 32 comments 0 vote. Chapter 3. Slowly growing up. Around 6 months have passed since my reincarnation. Throughout these months, I continued exhausting my mana every day, then I'd mindfully meditate for the reminder of the time I was awake, and I was serious about it. After another 5 months, equal to a whole 150 days, my mana capacity seems to have grown hundreds of times compared to what it was before. If my mana capacity was around the size of a bathtub 5 months ago, then now it was probably the size of an ellipse pool. In the very beginning my total mana seemed to double each day I exhausted my MP. While I don't think this rate of relative improvement was maintained for long, I was still progressing at a very fast pace. As my total mana amount became larger, my growth with each day that passed also increased. At that same time, my mana output naturally improved as well, and by now I was able to send out a river of mana through my hands, akin to a real small river. Because both my mana pool and mana output increased simultaneously, I was still able to use the simple method of pure mana manipulation to exhaust my mana without problems, even though my time required for it was increasing as my mana pool grew. Either way, my method of training remained viable for the time being, and hopefully will be until I begin learning real magic. 5 months ago I have also included into my schedule a slightly special mana output practice. It didn't take me too long to release all of my mana through my hands, and then I had a lot of free time each day. Given that I had a lot of free time, I began to spend a portion of it by releasing a part of my mana through my mouth instead of my arms. It was not the most efficient method, but it did not matter, since I had the time. My hope was that by training these magic pathways I might be able to develop them to the point that one day they can be used for casting real magic, just like through a regular person's hands. I could release my mana through my entire body as well, but I felt that this method was way too disorderly, chaotic and significantly too inefficient to eventually make it viable for casting spells. I had a strong feeling that I had to choose a single body part to focus on developing, and I eventually picked the throat. The mana flow to all body parts apart from my hands was equally terrible and didn't seem to be improving. If I at least picked the throat, it might allow me to be a bit better at using howling magic. At least, I knew that it was something that's possible from reading the novel, unlike casting magic directly from the feet. If I became too greedy and tried to accomplish something that was too ridiculous, I might just be wasting my time on an impossible task and accomplish nothing in the end. All this time I also continued my mindful meditation practice when I was out of mana. In conclusion, each day I would still mindfully meditate for a few hours while focusing on my breath, a peaceful state of mind and the condition of my body, as well as exhaust my mana at full power through my hands, but a portion of my mana I would always also release through my throat, attempting to strengthen the mana pathways in that area. In the meantime, while listening to Paul and Zenith's conversations during the last half year, I started to understand the new language a little bit. To be honest, it was very difficult for me to grasp this new language just by listening to the limited conversations around me while having no basic knowledge of the grammar or vocabulary. It was also unlike the languages I knew. Rudeus seemed to have learned it fairly easily in the novel, but I believe he compared it to Japanese at one point. And if it really is based on Japanese, then I'm out of luck, because I simply don't know Japanese. And so, it seems that learning this world's language will be a drag. By now, I am only able to understand some simple words as I try to grasp the basic grammar. Apart from this, over the last 6 months my body grew up a little and by now I had enough control to be able to crawl. I would crawl all around the house with a smile and explore it when I'm let out of the cradle, acting like a curious and cute child. I was able to send out my mana even while moving, so crawling didn't impede my training. Instead, I viewed it as a chance to improve my mana control as I practiced how to expel mana as quickly as possible while moving my body and being conscious of my surroundings. Zenith, Lilia and Paul all seem happy and excited with me being so active. I knew that I was really doted on and loved. He will run off somewhere once I move my eyes from him. Isn't it good that he's active? I was worried that he didn't cry at all when he was born. And that's why you tossed him into the air. Haha, don't remind me of that. I told you, he's my son too, so he'd be fine. But even now, he rarely cries. He almost only does it when his diaper is full. Yes, but I would prefer if he also didn't cry at night though, haha. I wasn't entirely sure what it was about, but Zenith and Paul had a discussion when they saw me crawling everywhere. In truth, I was aware that in the original Rudeus got away with being even more suspicious, but since I already only cried when I had a full diaper, I decided to also cry at night to appear more like a normal baby. Otherwise it would just be too strange for my taste and safety. In addition, I developed a rather nasty rash after delaying to report things the first time around, so that's another reason. A child's skin is quite sensitive, I suppose. Fortunately, Zenith seemed to have healed it with healing magic soon after at that time. Afterwards, I would always cry out more often and not worry about it. At this moment, I wanted to try something new. It was walking. Apart from growing my mana pool, these days I also wanted to start training my body from a young age. I remember that it was said in the novel that swordsmen awaken their battle aura instinctively through the training of their bodies. Perhaps, training, as a toddler would normally be silly, but it was the world of swords and magic, so I couldn't completely trust the usual logic. There was still a chance that beginning to train my entire body as early as possible might be beneficial. At the very least, I knew that it would not be detrimental to be simply active as long as I did things safely and in moderation. It would help my growth. In general, I tried to eat a lot to grow well, so doing some activity to burn the excess calories might also be good, so I don't grow too fat as a kid. Right now, I grabbed the leg of a table, which in my tiny hand appeared more like a giant wooden pillar, and slowly pulled myself up while also using my strength to straighten up my legs. Soon enough, I shakily stood on my two legs. It was very shaky and I had to support myself by holding onto the table's leg, but I was able to stand. Oh, my. Look. Seraph can already stand up. I heard my mother's excited voice. As I held onto the table's leg, a focused and serious expression appeared on my baby face. This is it. Even if I fall flat on my face, I'll do my best. It was said in the legends that the A-grade genius Gu Fang Yuan started walking at 4 months old. It was about time for me to get serious as well. My legs were shaking and I felt slightly afraid because of this, but I still let go of the table. And then I took my first few shaky steps. 1, 2, 3. Go, go. You can do it. Paul cheered. 4, 5. Pam. And then I fell as I was unable to keep my balance on my undeveloped legs. Before falling, I put my hands before my chest and protected it as I fell forward, rising my heavy head up to avoid it hitting the floor. Ouch. It still hurt a little. But of course, I did not cry. I was not mentally at an age where I would cry due to the smallest reasons. Seraph. Are you okay? My mother spoke up and rushed over to me. She then picked me up by my hips, but I saw that her expression was more happy than worried. After all, it wasn't like I suffered any serious injuries. I reflected a gentle smile as I looked back at her. She then lifted up my hands by the wrists and said, "Your hands are bruised, let me heal them." Divine power is rich and nourishing. It offers the strength to rise again to those who have lost their strength. Healing. As her hand emitted a dim light, I felt faint for an energy enter my body. Pretty. I called out while watching the shiny lights. The external mana flowed through me a little forcefully, and in an instant the pain on my hands disappeared. Whoa. See, it's okay now. After all, your mom was a renowned adventurer, my mother said in a boastful manner while smiling. I smiled. Yes. I wasn't wrong after all. It was the world of swords and magic. And I couldn't wait to begin learning real magic myself. Around 1 year has passed in total. There is no calendar anywhere in the house, but at one point I heard my parents talking about how I'm 1*year old, so there's that. At least, that's what I think they were talking about. Around that time I also discovered that my full name is Seraphim Greyrit. Seraph was simply a shortened version of my name that my parents often used to call me. Of course, over the last 6 months I continued meditating and exhausting my mana every day without fail, both through my hands and also throat. If my mana capacity used to be the size of a pool half a year ago, was it the size of a large lake by now? It was hard to say, but my mana pool had surely once again grown by a lot. Even if these days my mana capacity would only increase by a few % of the total size each day, given the large size of my total mana pool, I was still making great gains every day and over time. The time required for me to release all of my mana increased to around 3 hours of continuous release each day, so I was still far from reaching a bottleneck in my training. And this made me ponder. I have been exercising my mana reserves for a full year already, but I didn't reach a bottleneck even though I haven't yet even begun learning real magic. In contrast, in the novel Rudeus seemed to have reached a bottleneck after training for 1 year in the beginning and was unable to exhaust his mana even when casting beginner-level spells for a full day. At that point he needed to move on to intermediate rank spells and accidentally blew up a hole in the rooftop. As for me, no matter what, I have been exhausting my mana fully every day, so it isn't like I could train harder. Because of this I felt that my method was simply more time efficient than casting low-rank spells, so I haven't run into a bottleneck yet. I simply had no way to know the truth. Nonetheless, I decided that it was about time for me to begin showing interest in magic and books. Once I learn how to read, or once I'm directly taught magic, I can figure out my situation. For this, I formulated a small plan. One day I bruised my knee and then came up to Zenith to get it treated. I showed an amazed expression when seeing the lights heal my wound, just like before. After that, I would often come to her. It would point at my knee enthusiastically with a meaningful expression, and it didn't take long for her to realize that I wanted to see the pretty lights again. As this happened a few times and as I showed my interest in magic, Zenith began to show me various other small spells apart from just healing magic. Wind magic, water magic, fire magic and others. These were probably all the lowest level spells, but she could still do them. However, perhaps she didn't remember all of the incantations, because she sometimes read them out of a book. And the one time she took out a book is what I used as my chance. While pointing at the book in her hand, I said, "Mom, teach me." At this, Zenith looked at me with a smile and asked, "Oh, you want to learn magic?" I enthusiastically nodded my head. Zenith softly said, "I'm sorry, Angel, but you're too young to learn magic just yet." Seeing Zenith give me an apologetic face, I widened my eyes and showed her the cutest sad expression I could. "Pretty please. Ah, don't do this face. Mama just won't handle it. Twinkle, twinkle." I blinked my eyes as I looked up at her while acting like Puss in Boots, imagining them shining. Okay. But first you have to learn how to read. How about that? This should take you a few years. After seeing Zenith's defeated expression, I knew that the operation was a success. Like this, from that moment onwards, I began learning this world's alphabet with Zenith, whereas Paul would often read me a fairy tale before bedtime while pointing at various words in the book. Lilia would also often actively help me to learn various new words by pointing at different items around the house and the garden. The entire family worked together to help me learn the language and they seemed to be very happy with my enthusiasm toward learning. I remember that Rudeus had to decipher the magic guidebook after he learned how to read in secret by himself, so I certainly had an advantage when it came to my learning resources. A few years to learn how to read. Challenge accepted. 14 comments, 0 vote. Pissed. Download the app for additional rewards. More events, more perks. Winning you more free perks. Download now. Yod 21. Download app now. Chapter 4. Casting my first spell. 2 years passed in total. My comprehensive practice naturally continued. Another full year of training. Shish, Seraph is reading again. The young master is very fond of books. Let's not disturb him. I heard Zenith and Lilia whispers as they were probably spying on me behind the door of the study room again. I let out a silent sigh and returned to what I was doing with a small smile. I waved my legs slightly as I laid down on the ground on my stomach. A book was displayed open in front of me. There were 5 books at home in total. Traveling around the world greater than, less than Phyto's monsters, ecology and weaknesses greater than, less than Perugius's legend greater than, less than 3 swordsmen in the labyrinth greater than and finally less than guide to magic greater than. Apparently, books were expensive in this world. Although there was paper, there was no method for printing, so all books are written by hand like in the Middle Ages. What I was reading right now was the Guide to Magic. Zenith had read it to me many times in the past while explaining particular words. She had skipped the incantations, but I was not a stranger to this book. I guess, the fact that this book contained spell formulas that I could use to accidentally kill myself did not concern my parents. It was good to have such happy-go-lucky parents. They probably thought that I would not manage to cast any magic anyway. At this time, I was revising the information I learned from the book after rereading it on my own. Firstly, magic is classified into 3 main categories. They are attack magic, healing magic, and summoning magic. Magic can be used in a variety of ways, but according to the book, it was originally developed as an instrument of war. Similarly, the main use of the spells included in the guidebook is to defeat enemies or to slay monsters. Next, there are 7 difficulty ranks to magic: elementary, intermediate, advanced, saint, king, emperor, and finally god. It was said that an ordinary educated magician can improve his single specialized magic up to the advanced rank, while the typical uneducated one is able to cast elementary to intermediate ranked spells. The guidebook itself included spells for fire, water, earth, and wind magic. The ranks of spells ranged from elementary rank all the way to advanced, so it is certainly quite comprehensive. If I could reach advanced rank in these 4 magic styles without a tutor just thanks to this book, wouldn't I be amazing? I am not entirely sure yet if it is possible with just the information from the book though. Using magic consumes mana. This world's language seemed to be using the words, magic power, to describe mana, but inside my mind I secretly still called it mana. There are 2 ways of using mana: to use mana within the body or to draw out mana from something that contains mana, the example given being a magic crystal. At first glance, the first one was about using one's own reserves to cast magic, while the second one used an external mana source as a substitute, like a magical battery. Due to the development of magic, those with lower amounts of mana are unable to use higher-tiered magic. Thus, the use of magic crystals or magic tools that acted as batteries became more common. There are 2 ways to activate magic. The first one is through an incantation, and the second is through the use of magic circles. Incantations involve voicing out a magic spell's chant through one's mouth, while the use of magic circles required to draw a magic circle at a predetermined location or on a magical tool beforehand. Magic circles were popular a very long time ago, but in the current times incantations are the mainstream way of casting magic. In the distant past, the simplest incantation required about 1 to 2 minutes. It wasn't exceedingly long, but this method made magic very difficult to use in combat. In contrast, once a magic circle is drawn, it can be used repeatedly. The guidebook includes methods for using magic circles as well, but starting with incantations was my goal. I have a feeling that the magic circles included in the guidebook will be quite useless if I can manage voiceless incantations instead. In the end, I will probably only learn useful high-level magic circles in a magic school, like in the Ranoa Magic University. Interestingly, the book that I was reading was published by the Ranoa Magic University. It was surprising that it even included advanced rank spells. Was it because the publishers thought that an average person would not be able to master them without attending their university anyway? And someone talented could get access to these spells secondhand regardless? I think that should be the case. Going back to the topic of incantations, there existed a certain magician who successfully reduced the incantation time. Thus, incantations became the norm. These days the simplest incantations take about 5 seconds, so basic magic attacks could be used with an incantation. Another point in the book, a person's mana is set when they are born. I already knew that this point is false. If a person trained during early childhood, it was possible to grow one's mana reserves. Personally, I have grown my mana reserves tremendously during the last 2 years. I had no way to properly judge my mana capacity, but I felt that it should be well above that of an average adult magician. Hopefully, I'm still far from reaching my maximum potential. At the very least, I still seem to be improving. Last point, cutting the chant short or using silent incantations is only something that expert magicians can do. Chantless magic isn't something that's expected from a newbie. Hopefully, I will be able to bust that myth today. Alright, let's try it. I flipped the pages several times to the beginning. The book contained the following elementary rank water spells. Water ball, a water bullet that can be shot out. Water shield, water that rises from the ground to form a wall. Water arrow, a 20 centimeters dart that's fired. Ice smash, creates a column of ice to smite or freeze an enemy. Ice blade, forms a sword of ice. I got up from the ground, getting to my knees and looked at the guidebook next to me while kneeling. Throughout the year my reading ability and vocabulary improved considerably. I wasn't yet able to understand the meaning of all of the words included in the incantations, but I knew the alphabet and could read, so I could at least read out the chant. I stretched out my hand, focused on the text, and started to carefully read the incantation. Let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a refreshing burbling stream here and now. Water ball. As my words finished, I felt the sudden sensation of a small amount of mana flowing through my body and gathering in my right hand. Then a sphere of water materialized and formed to begin floating in front of my palm, the size of a handball. I did it. It was my first time casting magic, so it was impossible for me to not be excited. Mentally better prepared than Rudeus in the original, so I didn't immediately lose control of the spells. As I maintained the water ball, I then willed to gradually reduce the size of the water ball, aiming to get rid of it this way. However, as I exercised my imagination and will, nothing happened. After a short moment, I suddenly lost control of the spell and the fist-sized water sphere dropped down to the ground with a splat, some of the water splashing onto my feet. I guess this kind of thing can't be done with a spell that came from an incantation. To manipulate a spell so freely, silent casting should be a must. Let's go again. I walked to the side and dragged out a wooden bucket that I prepared beforehand from a corner, then stretched out my hand over it. I slowly closed my eyes and focused on relieving the feeling from earlier. Water ball, water ball, water ball, water droplets gather. As I tried to replicate the feeling from earlier, I could feel a faint warm current flow through my body, then small amounts of mana suddenly started gathering and being released through my palm. At the same time, I heard some quiet burbling sounds. I opened my eyes and saw a water ball that formed in the air, this time without me even uttering a single word. Great. I can do silent spellcasting. And it was not even that hard. Let's try the earlier experiment again. Become smaller, smaller. At my command, the water sphere gradually shrunk to the size of a chicken's egg. I could do that much. It was not very difficult. However, as I reached the size of an egg, I suddenly lost control of my spell and the small sphere of water dropped down to the bucket. Well, alright. I guess this was the limit of my control. Feeling excited, I quickly formed another water ball. Doing it for the second time, it felt even more natural. I directly dropped the ball into the bucket, then tried again. And I succeeded in forming another water ball. Without a fuss, without a chant and without my eyes being closed. It was not difficult at all. A natural feeling. I made it bigger, then smaller, then eventually dropped it into the bucket. With each attempt it was becoming easier and more natural. Good. I felt extremely happy and excited. Being able to do something magical like this simply with a thought was an indescribable feeling. Just this ability to cast chantless magic was enough for me to dominate a small part of this world. Soon enough, I'll try to test my current mana capacity. For a while I continued experimenting with a few different water, ice and wind spells that didn't have a chance of causing some kind of accident inside the house. In front of me laid a wooden bucket, this time frozen solid with icicles shooting out of it, as well as an ice sword. It was the result of my magic practice. After I performed a new spell using an incantation just once, I could then cast it without a chant by replicating the feeling. However, I haven't yet tried shooting out a spell. After casting, my spells would automatically hover in the air. Well, let's see. I was still way too small to reach the window, but fortunately the chair was already there. I slowly climbed up the chair, then looked through the window. No witnesses in sight. I then stretched out my hand toward the outside. It should be something like this. I exercised my imagination and moments later formed a blob of water in front of my hand just like before. A few moments later, the water ball shot out. After receiving the initial velocity, the water sphere's shape became slightly flattened and then it flew out in a small arc, landing on a patch of grass in the garden. A success. After that I formed another water ball and sent it out again, this time ramping up the speed a notch higher. My aim was the stone fence in the distance. As a result, my water ball flew over the fence, missing it. I lightly smiled back. This required practice, but it was not bad. Not bad at all. I managed to send a water ball flying without any problems. I remember that it took Rudeus quite some time to figure out the method to do it. Something like 2 weeks or 2 months. I didn't feel overly proud thanks to it, since I mostly relied on Rudeus's experiences and what I remembered from the novel. Once I kept all that I remembered in mind and focused, it wasn't hard to pull it off. There are certain steps to the use of incantations. Creation greater than setting of size greater than setting of firing speed greater than activation. Within this, the magic spell is done once the user determines the size and speed. Which means after voicing out the chant. 1. The spell automatically takes shape. 2. After this, within a fixed time frame, increase the mana input to adjust the size. 3. After the size adjustment, during a fixed time frame with extra mana input, was the adjustment of the speed setting. 4. Once the preparation period's over, the magic spell leaves the caster's hand, and automatically flies towards its target. This is the sequence of the entire thing. The trick is that after chanting, you need to add more mana twice. If there's no second adjustment to the firing speed, once the spell is released, it will not go flying. And to add on, when doing casting without an incantation, you have to process all of these by yourself. Still, the benefits of casting magic silently are enormous. Firstly, it allows you to skip the long and bothersome incantation, making the cast time several times faster than with an incantation. Secondly, it gives you an unlimited amount of time to adjust the size and speed of your spell. In other words, when cast silently, a lower ranked spell can be overloaded by pouring more mana into it, and over a period of long enough time it can reach the power of a much higher ranked spell. In comparison, when casting magic using an incantation, you only have about 1 second to set the size and speed of the spell, practically making each magic spell have a predetermined power level. Also, modifications can be done during the creation phase of silent casting, allowing the caster to change the spell's shape, structure and characteristics, for example, adjusting the shape of an earth wall or an ice sword. In conclusion, incantations are like cookie-cutter spells that you cannot modify, with mostly predetermined strength, while silent spellcasting gives the magician far more freedom. Then I tried casting a spell using my mouth instead of my hands. And as I tried, nothing happened. I didn't even know how to properly go about it. Ah. I let out a sigh of disappointment. Something that I kind of expected before happened. Silent casting is about replicating the mana flow that I experienced while casting a spell with an incantation. But that mana flow pattern leads toward my hands. Because of this, it's simply impossible for me to replicate the same mana flow by using my mouth, since then the pattern would change. I continued making attempts for a good while, but I simply had no idea how to go about modifying the mana flow to make it work. It was simply impossible. I frowned. My worry became real. At that moment I felt that casting spells from the incantation school through my mouth as a surprise attacker in an emergency is simply a bust. Silent spellcasting was all about replicating the flow of mana. And the smallest modifications to attempt adapting it to another body part one tried made it simply not work. The difficulty of modifying a spell was so high, it seemed impossible. It's possible I would need to develop a completely new incantations or spell for it to finally work. It seemed like all of my training by expelling mana through my mouth was mostly a waste of time. A failure. I let out a sigh. I wasted a considerable amount of time and effort into releasing mana through my mouth, wasted effort that I could have spent elsewhere. If I spent that time mindfully meditating, it would have been more productive. I felt regret creeping into my heart. But after a while I shook my head. My training was already extremely efficient and effective. So what if I run into a little blunder? So what if I wasted some of my time? Who would not experience failure? Verdant's son died regretfully. Start over again and proclaim oneself as king. I recited the words of my god, then swallowed the feelings of regret and moved past it. I didn't completely give up on mouth magic just yet. I exercised the mana pathways leading toward my mouth for almost 2 years now, but it should not have been a complete waste of time. It might still help me to be better at voice magic, the so-called howling magic of the beast race. My talent at manipulating pure mana should be rather unique among the people of this world. Perhaps there was still potential in me imitating the howling magic and developing a related move. Something like dragon shouts. Fu Saro Da. My heart thought. 35 comments 0 vote. Chapter 5. Practicing real magic. Thinking of all this, I let out a breath and pushed open the door of the study room. After walking through the corridor, I soon ran into the kitchen while wearing an excited smile. Inside the kitchen, Lilia was preparing dinner and Zenith was helping her. Zenith seemed to enjoy cooking and trying out various recipes with Lilia. She really was into the housewife's ordinary lifestyle. Oh, Seraph. What are you doing here? Are you hungry? Zenith greeted me with a beautiful loving smile. Lilia also turned to look at me. Her expression remained reserved, but I could see her eyes smiling. I shook my head at Zenith's question. After that I stretched out my hand and called out, Mom, look what I can do. I formed a sphere of water in front of my palm. Zenith was frozen for a moment as she stared at me, and then shouted out, voiceless magic. She was so loud that I was genuinely startled. I dropped the water bullet to the ground. Splat. Very quickly, her expression changed into a very intense smile and she slowly asked me, Seraph, how did you learn to do that? Zenith's expression was quite intense, but I know that was not due to anger. I muttered, I learned it from the book. The book on magic? Zenith asked while staring at me intensely. I'm sorry, I muttered quietly while casting my gaze downwards. Yeah. Zenith let out a high-pitched scream, then kneeled down and started hugging me tightly. I knew my Seraph was a genius. Lilia. What happened? I heard a shout. Paul bursted into the kitchen at that moment. Zenith let go of me and said, "Our boy is a magical genius. Seraph just cast his first magic. Without a chant." What? First magic? Without a chant? Zenith ignored Paul's surprise, kept raising my hands up and down and continued speaking, "Let's hire a magic tutor right away. This child will become a remarkable magician in the future." Paul was still confused, while Zenith was completely delighted. Paul spoke up, "A magic tutor? But he's only 2. No, wait. You said he can do voiceless magic." Seraph, show Dad what you can do," Zenith said as he looked at me with expectations. After a moment's lag, I faintly nodded my head at her. I momentarily looked up at Paul with a bit of childish fear, and then stretched out my hand. I let out a humming sound as I showed an expression of concentration. I slowly formed a water ball in front of my palm just like before. Yeah. Did you see that, dear? Seraph is a magical genius. Zenith ran up to Paul, grasped his hands and started jumping in exhilaration. Yay. Dear, go out to Roa tomorrow and put up a job request. This talent must be properly trained. I understand. But what about our promise? Paul replied in a somewhat neutral tone. Promise? Zenith asked. Ah, that promise. But he's so talented in magic. It would be a waste if he didn't choose to be a magician. I know that, but a promise is a promise. Zenith rebuked, "Don't you always break your promises? My matters have nothing to do with this." And so, a couple's quarrel began. As the quarrel persisted for a while, I quietly spoke up during a momentary silence, "Can I do both?" The 2 parents looked down at me. "Please don't fight. I can do both." "No." I softly said while blinking my eyes. "Train both in magic and swordsmanship?" Paul asked. I gently nodded my head with an uncertain expression, as if I was not entirely sure if I was in the right. "Ah, we just can't win with you. My angel." Zenith ran up to me and started squeezing me in her arms. "Ah, relax, woman. You'll kill me." Zenith wanted to hire a magic tutor right away. Paul did not object to the idea after seeing what I could do and after I also offered to train with the sword. But I personally shot it down and said that just learning from the book was enough for now. In the original, Roxy was hired only when Rudeus was 3 years old. If my parents tried to look for a magic tutor right now, then there is a chance that it would not be Roxy. Apart from other things, Roxy was said to be a good teacher in the novel. If the theoretical side of magic was concerned, I think it was true. It would be extremely difficult to find a better tutor that would come to this rural village to teach a kid of a low-ranked knight. For the time being, I felt that experimenting by myself just with the magic guidebook would be just right. Another mediocre inflexible tutor might only waste my time and fill my head with flawed ideas and misconceptions about magic. Through this year I can learn the spells in the book by myself and develop my own understanding of magic without being influenced by someone else. In the future, I could supplement it with Roxy's lessons to fill in any holes. It seemed like a good enough plan. Luckily, my parents didn't object to the idea of delaying to recruit a tutor. It was very likely because I was still way too young and also didn't yet master reading. My swordsmanship training was also delayed to when I'm 3 years old and my body developed a bit more. Unfortunately, I was forbidden from using magic unless someone was watching over me. Zenith and Paul should be worried that I might hurt myself or someone else. And it was not strange since a misfired spell could potentially blow myself up or cause fire. After all, once again, I was only 2 years old. However, the advantage was that I could try all kinds of spells in the courtyard without hiding and holding back. This was my main reason for revealing my talent. I did not need to hide myself inside the house, be limited to small and safe spells, and could freely experiment without worries. After the matter was settled, I immediately grabbed the magic book and walked outside to practice. Zenith stood behind my back with a bright smile as I was sitting in front of the magic guidebook. And then I started casting all kinds of spells. A gust of wind, a whirlwind, a fireball, a water wall, an ice pillar. I continued at it without stopping and Zenith excitedly cheered me on, from time to time correcting my pronunciation. "Hey, Seraph. Over here." I heard Paul's shout as he waved toward me. I turned my head to look over. Around this time, Paul also started his training in the courtyard, practicing swordsmanship shirtless, his well-trained body brimming with muscles. Seeing me look at him, Paul grinned. Magic is good, but firstly a man needs to be strong. Letting out a ha shout, he then swung out his sword at unperceivable speed and slashed at a huge boulder, causing it to break apart in a straight line almost as if cut by a blade. I then saw Paul slightly smiling with a proud look as he placed his sword over his muscular shoulders and looked at me. He asked, "What do you think, son, of the beauty of the sword?" I smiled. Did he bring that heavy boulder into the courtyard just to show off his 2-year-old son how he slices it in half? This should be the application of battle aura. Thinking of this secretly, I called out, "Dad, you're amazing." Ha ha. Paul grinned, looking quite happy. He's really easy to handle, huh? After slicing the boulder in half, Paul returned to his sword training, and I inadvertently took a peek. Ha. Ya. Ha. My father of this world seemed to be especially flexing that day, doing all kinds of flashy movements while letting out loud shouts. I felt that he was probably trying hard to get me interested in swordsmanship by showing off. Showing me that the sword wasn't any worse than magic. I found it to be somewhat cute. Paul was quite inconsiderate and a bit foolish, but he did try hard to be a respected father. At this moment, his movements with the sword were really quite mesmerizing. The way he handled the sword, his speed, power and grace, all of it looked very cool. Swords are cool. I can agree on that. He didn't need to convince me of it. Glancing to the side, I saw Zenith looking at Paul train shirtless with love in her eyes. I let out a breath. Maybe he was stupid, but even as a man I had to admit it, when he swung his sword like that, he looked quite heroic and attractive. I was not surprised that many women were into him. Hopefully I have inherited Paul's physique. And also his talent for the sword, or even better. I shook my head off unnecessary thoughts and focused back on the magic guidebook. That day I continued practicing magic in the garden and tried out all the elementary level spells of the 4 attack types from the guidebook. After repeating the spell several times, the feeling became ingrained into me more and more. What would come next is probably repeating the spells over and over to make casting them quickly without an incantation my second nature. Starting this kind of training while still very young instead of just producing water balls to burn off mana at this time should be immensely beneficial, so I plan to do just that. In regards to my mana reserves. Even though I cast plenty of various elementary rank spells, I could barely experience a dip in my mana level. In fact, my total amount remained stable and recovered in real time. After 2 years of training since basically day 1, my mana pool was like that. That was certainly a great result. Earlier I had no way to practically judge my mana capacity, but things looked quite well. The question remained how long I could keep growing my mana pool, but I had high hopes. I also experimented with adjusting the size and speed of my spells. As long as I did a spell chantlessly, I was able to modify it like this. I could turn a fist-sized water ball into a water sphere the size of a basketball or even the size of a hopping ball, and then I could increase the flying speed. Changing the shape was another level of difficulty, but I could still do that much. To be able to achieve all this, my magical affinity and talent of course seemed to be great. Could I have a Laplace factor? In Rudeus's case, he had taken over a body which would have normally died at birth because it presumably had a Laplace factor that was too powerful for a child's soul to handle. Perhaps I was the same, or perhaps not. My only hope is that the kinds of Laplace factors that I have, if I have them, would not interfere with my ability to manifest battle aura. From what I knew, a Laplace factor that improves mana capacity potential and the inability to manifest aura are not necessarily inclusive. Laplace factor and no talent for swordsmanship was simply the genetic hand that Rudeus was dealt. Apart from that, one thing that might not be related to Laplace factor, but could also be crucial in improving my magic talent is my outstanding ability to concentrate and focus. In general, my brain seems to be operating on high gears in this life. It was like this from the beginning. I did not have the tools to judge it before, but perhaps my thoughts are now flowing even more smoothly thanks to my mindful meditation practice. I trained my mind by meditating for hours each day as a newborn infant. This hopefully contributed to my brain's development. Either way, it seems to be the case throughout the novel that a person's potential for things like magic and swordsmanship are both often decided by their training during their early years. If you slack off as a teenager, you'd be stuck in the advanced rank like Paul for years to come, but in contrast, if you practice magic even at already 6 years old like Julie, which should be relatively old, you can boost your magical affinity and mana reserves. Similarly, originally Iris was meant to be stuck in a lifelong bottleneck of never being able to surpass Saint rank before she began to train hard during her youth because of Rudeus. If we followed logic from Earth, it would be possible for her to advance above the Saint rank eventually over the years, but no, she remained stuck at Saint rank for a lifetime unless she went hard at it as a teenager. Especially, the younger you are when you begin serious training in this world, the greater your future potential seems to be. With all this in mind, I feel that optimally training all my mana, body and mind during the most fundamental phase of a human's development, the infancy period, might be the key to breaking through my limits and improving my potential. Of course, that's what I plan to do anyway. While I am still very young, I need to milk this period to the fullest. Anyway, I was able to adjust the size and speed of my spells to a rather extreme degree. Zenith was especially shocked by how insanely big my water ball could get, but she fortunately expressed her shock with only happiness as she immediately bragged to Paul of how talented I was in magic. In turn, Paul appeared happy, but he also seemed somewhat disappointed. I guess he wanted his son to practice the sword with him. But it's all right. If I only have a bit of talent, I would try to master the sword as well. Back to my magic practice. It was impossible for me to run out of mana even if I kept using elementary rank spells for the entire day. In comparison to expelling pure mana out of my body at full throttle when I used my original training method, doing it through an elementary level spell was like placing a funnel-like limiter on myself, slowing down the expulsion rate. Even though this time the mana was now put to proper use to produce a physical phenomenon in reality, which might logically require more mana than simply expelling it out, the amount of mana used per second was not higher. In conclusion, simply expelling my mana into the atmosphere at full power through my hands was still the best method of using up my mana reserves. That was in comparison to an elementary level spell. Perhaps once I get to higher ranked spells, there might be a change. Thinking of this, I wanted to attempt casting an intermediate rank spell for the first time. I aimed my hand toward the sky, then slowly recited, "Supple spirit of water and princess of streams that flow through the earth, sweep away all things with your hidden inner might." I could feel mana flowing through my body as I chanted. The difficulty had spiked up quite a bit. Unlike before, this magic required control. Until now, I didn't use such a level of control when reciting the incantations of elementary ranked spells. However, it wasn't something that proved to be a challenge. I soon finished the chant, "Water Cannon." A hopping ball-sized water ball formed in front of my palm, then I concentrated, adjusted the speed and sent it to explode in the sky. Casting an intermediate ranked spell was still not too difficult. Zenith was shocked. Paul was shocked. Unfortunately, I had gotten ahead of myself because after witnessing me cast less than water cannon greater than, Zenith forbade me from using intermediate ranked magic just yet, probably out of concern for my safety. Many of the intermediate ranked spells had a significantly increased area of effect and deadliness, so Zenith actually said something a parent should. Good grief. 20 comments 0 vote. Chapter 6. 3 years old. After I showed off my Chapter 6. 3 years old. After I showed off my talent in magic, I was able to practice all kinds of spells in the garden without a worry. As long as someone watched over me. It was great. There were many spells that I couldn't cast at home, for example fire spells or something with a large effect like a water wall. It would be too impractical for me to hide if I wanted to improve my skill in magic. After practicing in the garden during the first half of a day under the eye of Zenith or Lilia, I would then secretly expel the rest of my accumulated mana during the second half of a day, either by condensing intermediate ranked spells that I learned in secret or by expelling it out raw. Meanwhile, Paul continued swinging his sword in the garden. In regards to my swordsman training, 1 year ago I have already begun semi-serious physical conditioning, secretly doing sets of push-ups, squats, frog jumps and others. I did it whenever Paul was away in the morning to avoid his eyes, since my training was sometimes a bit too methodical for a 1 to 2 year old child. As I reached 2 years old, I planned to no longer hide myself with my training and take it even more seriously. I would keep careful track of my total volume, intensity, progress and nutrition. Sometimes I would do calisthenics in secret, sometimes I would pretend to imitate Paul while he trained. A bit of flexibility training was also included. My skill in manipulating earth magic was not yet good enough to create proper training equipment, so for the time being I was limited to creating stone dumbbells and barbells that were mostly just the bar. To make them heavier, I would simply make them longer. One thing that changed in my training at 2 years old was that I no longer included blocks of meditation in my schedule. I didn't even meditate before sleep, as I didn't want my brain to associate the state of focus and concentration with me going to sleep. Instead, I would mindfully meditate between my strength training sets, paying close attention to the state of my body as I was calming down my racing heart rate and breathing. I believe it was the most optimal way. In conclusion, I continued training my magic and mana, continued exercising my brain and body, while Zenith, Lilia and also Paul continued teaching me the language. Time passed. 2 weeks after I started practicing magic outside the house. I quickly mastered all of the elementary ranked spells and experimented with them to improve my mana control. During this time I also secretly learned most of the intermediate ranked spells. Fortunately, all that I needed to do was to quietly manage to chant an intermediate ranked magic once and then I could do it silently. Once I did something like casting X-Flame into the sky, Zenith would brush it off if she had not heard me, probably thinking that I just shot out a large fireball. Afterwards, when I cast magic voicelessly, no one could tell whether it was a powered-up elementary ranked spell or an intermediate ranked spell. And it was especially true since I could reduce the size and power of my spells. This way, I was practicing intermediate rank magic and no one knew about it. Because I couldn't just make my spells as powerful and huge as possible, as it would attract too much attention, to increase my control of magic I did things like this. For example, I would create intermediate rank less than explosion greater than fireballs that are small in size yet contain very intense and concentrated heat as I try to push in as much mana into them as possible, but not release them in the end. Or I would create a small icicle field, using intermediate rank less than ice pillar greater than, but I would only produce an average amount of ice yet focus on making it extremely cold and hard. Or I would create an earth wall or a rock bullet, trying to make them as dense and strong as possible. All of these didn't look very impressive on the surface, but they pushed my ability to concentrate my mana into a spell to the maximum. What was more frowned upon by my parents was when I was shooting out rock bullets and wind blasts at the maximum speed to practice improving the speed of my spells, and at full power it was causing loud sonic booms. However, I believed that spell speed was one of the most important aspects of my training, so I still did it. After all, it's meaningless how strong a spell is if it cannot hit the target. For this, I practiced the firing speed of my spells every day, shooting out rock bullets from my window at the stone dummies I would previously create in the courtyard. I wish I could go all out to cause huge explosions, walls of ice and shoot out missile-sized projectiles to truly exercise my mana output, but I think that my magic training method was still better than that of Rudeus in the novel, who was only creating water balls inside his room around the same time. At the same time, I also practiced adjusting the shape of my spells to improve my magical dexterity and finer control. Whether it was changing the shape of earth spells, ice spells or even water and fire spells. Eventually, a full year passed, seasons changed and it was summer once again. Today I was 3 years old. Over the last year I mastered all the elementary, intermediate and advanced spells of the 4 attack types from the magical guidebook through self-study. Silently, of course. In addition, Zenith also taught me elementary and intermediate healing magic, as well as elementary rank detoxification magic. I discovered that there was no special secret to mastering different and higher ranked spells apart from them requiring more demanding ability to manipulate mana, higher concentration and the skill to condense mana. Most people required a long period of training to be able to learn to cast a new spell, but I could grasp them in an instant. As long as I just knew the words of an incantation, I could learn any advanced rank spell. Throughout the year my mana reserves have also increased tremendously once again. It grew again by so much that I began suspecting that I really have the Laplace factor. The power of my spells was also substantial. Just because I started training in magic as a little kid, I have already easily surpassed the great majority of expert magicians in this world. I still continued growing my mana reserves every day, practicing mana condensation and improving my magic control by doing things like creating stone figurines, but it was difficult for me to improve in other areas. I have gone through the guidebook countless times already. I needed a magic tutor. In the evening, our family of 3 plus Lilia had dinner together as usual. Paul sat in the seat of honor at the end of the table, while his wife Zenith sat on his left and I sat beside her. Opposite to me, with one empty seat separating her from Paul, sat Lilia. Zenith held her palms clasped and recited a prayer before the meal. Holy Millis, who watches over us in distant lands, we thank you for blessing us with life-giving nourishment. There was no special celebration, but according to my parents, I was 3 years old today. Still, the meals were a little more extravagant today than normal, and I could clearly see the impatience and excitement on Paul's face. Time to eat. As Zenith finished saying the grace, Paul announced the beginning of the meals, with several other people following suit. Time to eat. Time to eat. I looked down at my bowl with a small smile. A simple wooden bowl, a wooden spoon and a rough ceramic cup. Laying next to it, a large handmade bun. I first scooped up some of the cooked white beans. These were not too delicious by any means, but the simplicity of the meal contained a certain beauty and charm. As the meal nearly finished, Zenith spoke up. Dear, it's about time. Seraph is already 3 years old. Go to Roa tomorrow and find a tutor for him. We'll definitely find a good magic teacher in Roa. My eyes lit up when I heard this. Finally. After I get a tutor, I can not only improve my knowledge on magical theory, but I will also be able to finally go all out with my magic once there is a competent adult magician around to act in case of emergency. Know that there would be any emergencies, but I'm still a toddler, so I'm not surprised that Zenith and Paul worried about it. Seraph, from now on you'll also have to start training hard with the sword. Do you understand? Paul asked me with a slightly stern look. Yes. Good. Paul nodded his head. He raised his finger and continued, listen here. My training will be harsh. There's a possibility of you getting tired of the sword and giving up halfway. Huh. What's with that annoyed look? Paul asked. Nothing. I just don't think I'll give up. I think a sword is cool, I answered awkwardly. Did I show my emotions on my face too much? I see, Paul muttered. He gave me a deep look. He then smiled. Dear. Zenith asked as Paul remained in that strange state, as if reminiscing. Paul chuckled and shook his head. It's nothing. I just thought back to when I was a kid. I had the exact same thoughts. Paul grinned. I didn't know what to say. Actually, he had these thoughts and then what happened? Well, it isn't like I'll end up like Paul and waste the prime of my life chasing after skirts. First strength. Paul raised finger and continued lecturing. Seraph, my first sword instructor told me that swordsmanship is all about how serious you are about the sword. Although you can cast magic silently, a swordsman always has an advantage against a mage. There's merit in you taking swordsmanship seriously as well. Become a mage who can also fight in close combat. Yes. Paul nodded solemnly, then opened his mouth again. Zenith squeezed Paul's jaw with one hand to stop him from talking. Okay, enough. Stop this boring talk. I'm sure Seraph will do just fine. Look what I have here. She then excitedly pulled out a large book. I have already seen her hiding it early. She finally brought it out. Mom. Zenith placed it on the table and flipped through the pages. The pages were empty. Rather, it was a large notebook. Zenith smiled. I heard that you wanted to have a sketchbook for drawing. I got this for you, as well as some pencils. I always wanted one. Thanks. My face was full of smiles. I always wanted more notebooks to make notes in and a sketchbook to practice my drawing skills, but there just weren't many of those in the house. I happily received the sketchbook from Zenith and started looking it over. Paul showed a wry smile. Zenith interrupted his serious father's speech because of this. 34 comments 0 vote. Chapter 7. Roxy appears. After Paul sent a request to the Magic and Adventurer guilds, we quickly found a magic tutor. The village had no inn, so the job offer included accommodation too. A day later, the teacher arrived at our house. I am Roxy. Please give me your guidance. It was a young girl dressed in a brown magician's robe, her light blue hair in braids, and her body reminiscent of that of a 14-year-old girl. The white skin, devoid of any suntan, was accompanied with sleepy half-opened eyes. She had curt-looking lips, and though she's not bespectacled, she does give the image of a studious girl always working in the library. She was holding a bag in one hand, the other hand holding a staff similar to one I have previously seen in the anime. She met with the three of us in the house's entrance. It was Roxy. Thank God there was no sudden change. In regards to Roxy that I knew from the anime and the novel. In truth, in the beginning I wasn't much of a fan of Roxy. Rudeus excessively glorified her in a cringy way, and certain fans seemed to obsessively love her, but I personally didn't find her very attractive, and I even thought she's a bit stupid and autistic. However, as I matured and came back to reread the work, I was able to appreciate her more. After putting aside the goddess nonsense Rudeus spouts and how the narrative forcefully portrays her as extremely intelligent, which she is not as intelligent as just book smart and logical, I started seeing Roxy for who she is. A clumsy and still childish book smart Lolita magician girl who tries hard to be acknowledged despite her shortcomings. A girl heavily self-conscious of her small body and heritage, with an idealistic and silly dream of romance like from a novel. And as I saw her for who she is, I then began to like her as a character. A cute, smart, loyal and hardworking girl. She's certainly a girl that might be worth it. Meanwhile my parents were speechless as they looked at her. You're that home tutor. Zenith stuttered. Paul, that's, really. Roxy remained expressionless and said, yes, I'm the home tutor. Which is the student I'm supposed to teach? You're supposed to teach our son Seraph, Zenith introduced me, placing her hand on my head as she stood behind me. I sent Roxy a child's innocent cute smile. And she immediately let out a sigh, I guess it happens from time to time, idiot parents who think their child has talent after growing slightly. Although she only grumbled quietly, I think everyone heard it. What was it? Paul asked. It's nothing. However, I think that your son won't be able to understand the principles of magical theory. Not at all. He can already cast elementary and intermediate spells. He doesn't even need to chant. He's a genius. Zenith excitedly bragged. From an outsider's perspective, all that she said probably sounded incredibly ridiculous. It really was ridiculous. But well, it was of course all true. By now I have also already convinced Zenith to allow me to cast intermediate magic legitimately and without having to hide it. She's way too soft. At this time, Roxy looked at her apathetically with suspicion. She emotionlessly said, "Ah, right. He can cast intermediate rank magic without a chant, can I see it then?" "No problem. Seraph, go show her." Zenith pushed me forward with a bright smile. "Well, okay." Like this, me and Roxy stepped out of the house. Zenith and Paul were watching us from the porch. Roxy was looking at me with a gaze as if she was not expecting anything. Some kind of bad joke maybe. As for me, what to cast? Intermediate magic. Let's just go with less than water cannon greater than then. I stretched out my hand toward the sky and activated the spell. Water cannon, I muttered under my nose. There was no need for me to say the spell's name. I only said it for people to know what I'm doing. Water began to gather in front of my palm and within less than a single second, a huge sphere of water the size of a hopping ball was formed. I stopped at this size, then set the speed, making it rather average. Then I shot it up into the sky. As the water sphere was shot out, it slightly changed its shape due to the air pressure, taking more the shape of a bullet, then continued flying for several seconds high toward the clouds, forming a small rainbow on its path. Boom. Then the water sphere exploded, causing gentle rain to fall somewhere out there. How was that? Zenith asked with a grin. Roxy frowned at her. Is this some kind of joke? Where are the magic circles? Magic circles. Zenith tilted her head. Roxy let out a breath and said, "You can't fool me like this. You should have installed magic circles somewhere around here." She then started looking around. Apparently, she didn't think a 3-year-old kid could cast intermediate magic chantlessly and she was probably being pranked. I found it to be a little funny. In truth, that water cannon was just a tiny fraction of my power. Ah, haha. There are no magic circles, Paul spoke up with an awkward smile. How about Seraph casts another spell then? Zenith spoke up. Go Seraph, cast something else. Okay. Let's see, explosion. A rather small fist-sized ball of concentrated flame formed in my hand, which I then shot toward the sky. Boom. The flaming sphere exploded with a loud bang. I looked up at Roxy innocently. At that moment, Roxy looked shocked and confused. As everyone looked at her, waiting for her answer, she emotionlessly said, "I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not qualified to teach him." I stared at Roxy with widened eyes. Excuse me? Zenith asked. Roxy narrowed her eyes and turned her head away. This talent needs to be properly trained. I'm not sure if I could do it. Zenith and Paul were silent, probably a bit dumbfounded. Meanwhile I blinked my eyes. If Roxy left here without teaching me anything, it would just be a joke. My thoughts raced quickly, and I then ran up to Roxy and grabbed her hand. She turned to look down at me. And I used my classic move, large shining eyes and the cutest face I could make. It never failed me before. No, please, Roxy-sensei. Please, teach me. I gently asked while grabbing her hand with both hands. I can do some magic, but I still have a lot to learn. I'm sure you have a lot of experience and a lot to teach me. Please. Twinkle, twinkle. Please. Roxy let out a long sigh. All right. Thank you. And with that, Roxy was hired as my magical instructor. It was decided that in the morning, it'll be Roxy's lessons, and in the afternoon, it'll be swordsmanship practice under Paul. For the first lesson, Roxy brought me to a spot in the garden right away. I was sitting on a wooden chair brought out from the house. Roxy walked in front of me while speaking. Well, let's start from the magic textbook. No, before that, let me ask you, how did you learn to use voiceless incantations? She looked at me as if I was a little monster. Is incantation necessary? Of course it is, normally, Roxy said. I always thought that incantation is only there to teach you the spell. And then you can just replicate the feeling, I explained. Replicate the feeling. I nodded, swinging my feet while sitting on the oversized chair. I added, yes. When casting magic there's a way that the mana flows. Then you just have to replicate that feeling. Roxy looked at us while being silent. She closed her eyelids for a while, then eventually let out a sigh as she opened them again. She asked, "Do you feel tired now?" After casting all that magic before, she means, I guess. "No, I'm fine," I said. "I see. Anyway, let's go back to the lesson. Your mom said that you can cast intermediate magic. How did you learn it? Did someone teach you?" In truth, I already learned almost all of the advanced spells from the guidebook as well. It is just that Zenith doesn't know about it. I'm sure Lilia knows though, but she didn't rat me out. "Lilia's the best," I replied. "I learned it from a book." "From a book? You can read as well?" Roxy looked at me with eyes wide like saucers. Apparently, the fact that I can read at 3 years old was just as shocking as my ability to cast magic without a chant. I am not sure of the literacy rate in this world, but it seemed to be atrociously low even for teenagers and adults. It was said in the novel that most swordsmen in the Holy Land of Swords never learned to read. "Yes. My parents taught me since I was little," I muttered. "I see. You really have good parents then," Roxy said, smiling. She then slowly approached her bag and started rummaging through it. Soon enough, she pulled out a book and opened it on the first page, showing it to us. "Is this the book that you read?" "Yes, I think so," I said. Although I sounded uncertain, I was 99% sure that it was the same book published by Ranoa University of Magic. Roxy faintly smiled at this, then said, "I see. In that case you should be aware of the basics of magic." I said, "Yes. I read everything that's in the book. But it would be good if you went through it again." "I see. Let's start from the basics then." Roxy coughed gently and then started her lecture. In broad terms, there are 3 types of magic: attack magic, healing magic and summoning magic. Each is divided into 7 ranks: elementary, intermediate, advanced, saint, king, emperor and god. You should already know that much. A magician's ranking title is determined by the most advanced spell he can cast. As for myself, I'm a saint-ranked water magician. She said the last line with a little pride. I could hear it. "Whoa, you're amazing," I commented offhandedly. And I could see Roxy puff out her cheeks in pride. She tried to hide it by looking to the side, but she seemed happy and satisfied. "She's so childish, really." Roxy let out a small cough and replied, "As long as you keep practicing, I'm sure you'll be able to easily reach saint rank as well." I said nothing. As long as I poured enough magic power into an advanced rank spell at this very moment, it could probably reach the power of a saint rank spell. If Roxy showed me a saint rank spell, I might be able to replicate it. Maybe. After all, after what I have been doing over the last 3 years, learning a new advanced rank spell is like picking my nose, there is no difficulty in it. Let's return to the lesson. Intermediate and advanced magic is usually the highest ranked magic that's used in combat. Saint ranked spells often affect the weather and a large area. They would be only used during large battles or castle sieges. Yeah. Although saint-ranked magic sounded cool, it didn't seem like it had much use during real battles against a few or one powerful opponent. These were massive AoE spells that had little use during skirmishes. Reign over a large area. What use does it have when there's a swordsman rushing straight at you to cut off your neck? I remember that combat spells in the anime and novel was often limited to mostly intermediate magic for 1v1 and advanced magic for AoE, even for Rudeus. That's because these cause more concentrated damage and are not as costly to cast. Sadly, saint-ranked magic and above didn't have much use. Roxy continued, advanced rank magic affects a much larger area than intermediate magic and is also significantly stronger. For example, Exodus Flame. She then stretched out her hand and started chanting, Raging Spirit of Flame, Bastard of Hell. Rise to the land of man and swing your fist. Strike down my sworn foe and consume them within darkness. Exodus Flame. An enormous ball of fire formed floating above our heads that then shot out at immense speed into the sky. Boom. The sphere of flames exploded in the air, creating huge fireworks. Roxy then looked at me with some expectations. However, I remained rather unimpressed. I already knew the Exodus Flame spell. I cast it when Paul was at the watchtower and Zenith was helping in the village's clinic. I gently smiled. Did she just cast it to show off? I guess she wanted to regain some face. But I didn't call her out on this. I only felt it was a bit funny. Amazing. I said. Roxy smiled a little. 22 comments 0 vote. Chapter 8. First lesson with Roxy. Roxy's first magic lesson was very simple so far. We were just going through the basic principles of magic, with Roxy reviewing my knowledge and comprehension. Roxy was a good teacher. Once she saw that I understood a certain subject, she moved to another. There seemed to be no clear flaws in her knowledge, but I think the fact that there was little for her to teach me when it came to the basics was annoying her and hurting her pride a little. After all, I was not a complete newbie that you'd expect from a little kid. I have my own understanding of magic, knowledge from reading the novel and also experiences from my previous life, so a lot of what she told me was common knowledge or common sense. Most importantly, I have the mind of an adult. I have already gone through the magic guidebook countless times and experimented with magic for a year. I didn't require Roxy's teachings to become a powerful mage since it was mostly about talent and training, but still, Roxy's knowledge and practical experiences were valuable. I could feel like my view of the world broadened when I listened to her. There is only so much a person can learn about magic from a single book. Obviously, I could see at a glance that in large part the world's understanding of magic was quite limited and primitive. No matter how well read Roxy is, there are many things that are left unexplained. For example, magic spells expend different amounts of mana depending on the changes to the size. If the default is 1 for a silent cast, additional mana will be expended the more I expand the spell and increase the speed. But in contrast, if I make the spell smaller and weaker, I also have to expend more mana. Creating a single droplet of water requires more mana than creating a fist-sized water ball. I asked Roxy this question, but the only answer I got was, "That's just the case." It looks like the common public doesn't know the answer. I had a simple hypothesis though. It's probably because that's how it's supposed to be. In other words, that's how spells are designed to be. Let's say, a water ball spell costs 1 mana and creates a hand-sized ball of water. The moment you activate the spell, you gather 1 mana, no matter what. If you want to reduce the size of the water ball to the size of a water droplet, you will need to expand additional mana for the change of volume. Basically, when you cast water ball, it has a predetermined mana cost, even when you do it chantlessly. When you want to reduce the size, it expends additional mana to remove the equivalent amount of water mana from the water ball. It's an additional mana cost that's separate from the mana amount designed to formulate the base structure of a spell. The only way to reduce the mana cost is if you create a completely new spell that's designed to create a water droplet. Then it will only consume a little bit of mana. Teacher, why do incantations work? Seraph asked at one point. They just do, Roxy patiently replied with her usual expressionless face. I see. The same kind of answer. Basically, why does a string of specific words cause such a special effect? Do the words resonate with some rules of the world or a deity, like words of power in Skyrim? Or are the incantations a method of self-hypnosis over one's magic circuits like in Nasuverse of Fate? Understanding this would be the key to creating new magic spells, something that had never truly happened in the novel. The truth behind incantations. Looks like it's unknown. Roxy said, well, what should I say? First of all, the magic that you normally use, are you aware who was the one that figured it out? No. Yes, it's good to be honest. And to answer it, magic is said to have come from the ancient long-eared race High Elves. High Elves. Like Elinalise. I frowned. I remember that Elinalise was chased out of the elven forest after assaulting too many men. The wives of these cheating men banded together, out of jealousy, and chased her away. A fun fact. Roxy continued, long-ears High Elves are a race living in the north of the Millis continent. According to Roxy's explanation, a very long time ago, before the war between humans and demons broke out, the world was still in chaos and wars arose everywhere. During that time, ancient long-eared race High Elves were able to communicate with the forest spirits, manipulating the earth and winds to fight off the invaders. It's said that it was the world's oldest magic. How were they communicating with the spirits? Was it through words? I asked. I am not sure. It isn't explicitly stated. The current magic is derived from the human race imitating the ancient High Elves, magic during the wars back then, and evolving it. The incantations of today are shortened versions of incantations humans used in ancient times. I see. This wasn't very helpful. What are forest spirits? I asked. And my question seemed to stump Roxy again. Sorry. Roxy said, I'm not sure. Spirits are related to summoning magic, but I don't know much about it. I see. Basically, she doesn't know. I also don't have any clues. I guess I'll just have to drop the topic for now. Roxy looked downwards and muttered, I'm sorry I'm such a useless teacher. Oh, wow. I really sunk her confidence, did I? I forced a smile and said, no, not at all. I'm learning a lot. Roxy stayed expressionless. You don't need to be polite. I'm not quite qualified to teach someone like you. I shook my head and continued, no. You're a great teacher. And I'm learning a lot. You don't need to be ashamed about things you don't know or can't do. I thought for a moment, then said, you know what you know, and you can do what you can do. I think you're amazing, teacher. It's only shameful if you give up on learning. I said it, then tried to give her my brightest cherubic smile. I put a lot of thought into my lines, I hope it works. Roxy continued looking at me for a long while. She then softly smiled, extended her hand and flicked my forehead. Ouch. I felt that from that moment onwards I got along with Roxy much better. It isn't that she's a bad teacher. I'm simply a demanding student. We've covered enough theory for now. How about we do some practical training? Roxy said. Okay. Let's start with water ball, said Roxy. Will she do it? Will she do it? Roxy raised her staff and faintly pointed it at her target. Let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a refreshing burbling stream here and now. Water ball. When Roxy recited the spell, a basketball-sized water bullet was formed in her hand. It flew towards one of the trees at high speed. Crash. The branches snapped easily, and the fence got soaked. She did it. Afterwards, she looked at me expressionlessly. Did she expect praise for her aim? Teacher, that tree is one that Mother raised and treasures. I guess Mother will be angry, I said, slightly nodding. Roxy. Really? Yep. I nodded my head. One time Dad swung his sword and cut some of the branches. Mom was furious. This isn't good, got to think of something. Roxy frantically ran to the tree, and picked up the fallen branches. I then watched from my chair Roxy with her face red pick up the branches. Let the power of God be converted into a bountiful crop, and bestowed into ones who had lost their strength to stand up once again, healing. With the chant, the branches attached themselves together back to how they were before. Phew. Roxy let out a breath of relief, then started walking back to us. After Roxy's lessons, there was lunch shortly after noon. Roxy was invited in as well. When me and Roxy entered the dining room after being called in by Zenith and Paul, the table was already mostly filled with utensils and dishes. Meanwhile, Lilia continued walking around to bring in the rest of the meals and drinks. Roxy. You can sit here. We'll start in a minute. Said Zenith. Yes. Thank you for inviting me. Roxy politely sat down on a chair that Zenith brought out. Seraph, don't touch anything before everyone sits down, yes. Zenith lectured. Yes, Mom. Zenith enjoys it when I call her Mom, so I did just that. Even though from my perspective I'm akin to an evil spirit of a man older than her that had taken over her son's body and pretends to be her cute little son, so there's a bit of guilt and awkwardness involved when using such an intimate word. Anyway. I jumped up onto the chair in my usual seat. Meanwhile, Paul took a large gulp from his jug while sitting down in the seat of honor, then let out a satisfied breath. Ha! Drinking so early in the day. You're going to die young, I muttered when seeing this. Paul laughed. Ha ha. I'll be just fine. Your old man won't kick the bucket so easily. I let out a light breath hearing this. Be careful what you say. You might have as well just triggered a flag. Toward Paul, I had quite complicated feelings to be honest. He was quite trashy in the novel, but he didn't give me any reasons to complain so far in reality. Maybe apart from him and Zenith making it difficult to fall asleep every night. Wish they had some kind of soundproofing in their bedroom. I sighed. What's this? Want some, Seraph? Paul extended his mug toward me. I shook my head. No, thank you. Haha, I was just kidding. Paul laughed. By the way, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking that I kind of owe you for bringing me up, but if you betray Zenith's feelings and break your vow the same way as in the original, I probably still won't go easy on you, I answered in my mind. I was a guy that also secretly wanted a harem. But it was about integrity. And also about the way Paul views and treats his spouse and women in general. Paul looked at me. I smiled and replied, nothing. I was just hoping you would live a long life, so please don't drink, Dad. Paul was a little stunned for a moment, then grinned. No worries. I won't die at least before I see my grandkids. Why be so specific? I rolled my eyes inwardly. Of course, in the novel Paul died just when Rudeus had his first kid, without ever seeing his grandkids. Alright, let's start, Zenith spoke up as she sat down at the table. Soon after, Lilia politely sat down as well on the opposite side, next to Roxy. First, let's say a prayer. When everyone was already seated, Zenith recited a short grace as usual while the others silently listened. Let's eat. Soon enough, lunch began. I smiled. The food was really extravagant today for lunch. The table was packed. Zenith and Paul should have wanted to give a good impression on the magic tutor. These meals were being prepared this morning, ever since we got the news of the tutor coming yesterday. Paul soon started talking about his S-rank adventurer background and about how he met Zenith. After that, it was Zenith's turn to introduce herself and she talked about the capital of Milishan. Dad, can you give me some? I asked while pointing at a chicken which was grilled whole. It really looked delicious. Furthermore, sufficient protein was the most important for a child's growth, research and common sense said. Sure thing. What do you want? A drumstick? Yeah. Paul then cut out a large drumstick from the grilled chicken that he was devouring by himself, then passed it onto my wooden cutting board that served as my plate. Thanks. No problem. Just don't eat too much or you'll puke. After this it's your first swordsmanship lesson. Yes. As the meal continued, I could see Roxy looking both shy and happy as she tried the various dishes in a merry atmosphere. Say, Roxy, where are you from? Paul asked at one point. To formally put it, I'm from the meagered village from the Bigoya area in the demon continent, Roxy answered with an emotionless tone, yet with anxiety on her face. So you're from the demon race? Yes. Zenith, Paul and Lilia all looked at Roxy. I see, Paul replied indifferently, then took a gulp of his beer. Zenith and then Lilia also returned to their meals after a moment. And I could see Roxy's eyes widen in surprise. Anyway, welcome. You must have had it tough as a demon on the central continent, Paul said with a warm smile. It wasn't too bad, Roxy said, a clear lie. Is the discrimination against demons so bad? I pondered. Apart from her hair color, she still looked very much human. Who would discriminate against a girl like her? Paul then asked Roxy a few casual questions. It turned out that she had just graduated from Ranoa University. Teaching me was her first job as a tutor, and her first job after leaving the school. Talk about running into a tough first job. I now understood more why she didn't have full confidence in being a capable teacher in the anime, whether for Rudeus or for the perverted fat prince in that kingdom. And especially for me here. Eventually, the lunch ended. After the meal, there was an hour's break for me to digest what I ate. I spent that time practicing my drawing skills a bit using the new sketchbook I got, drawing the scenery outside my window as well as some of the magic circles from the magic guidebook. It wasn't long after when Paul shouted after me, calling me down for sword training. 10 comments 0 vote. Chapter 9. First sword practice, principles of healing magic. After lunch, in the early afternoon was the time for my training with Paul. Paul was already aware that I have been diligently doing physical training every day, so for that day he instead prepared me a short wooden sword fitting my body size. I was supposed to begin serious sword practice now that I was already 3 years old. Normal kids start sword training at around 5 years old, but I was of course not a normal kid. But first he made me jog around the house for a while. I guess even this world knows the importance of warm-up. Afterwards, Paul began showing me various sword moves in a slightly disorganized manner. His teaching method was very straightforward, as he was only able to perform the strikes to show them to me and at most tell me whether I replicate them well or not. He was unable to tell me what exactly I did wrong or how I could improve. For example, he would show a sword strike while saying, slash. Like that. And if you did it wrongly, he would say, wrong. This is how you slash. But it was still a far better method of training than pointlessly swinging a sword with no idea of what was right and what was wrong. I had no complaints here. In truth, I already have a little bit of experience with Hema fencing from my previous life. But I never did any real sparring with someone. It was just sword drills by myself done for fun while watching videos from YouTube using a steel bastard sword I bought online. In essence, I already knew a few basic stances, guards, slashes, thrusts, blocks and counters. I have also watched many videos on sparring and swords, so while I might suck at actual fencing, I had some theoretical knowledge that Paul was not quite able to share with me. But because of just that, Paul seemed to think that I have a natural talent for swordsmanship and praised me endlessly. He called me an instinctive type, just like him. Since I grasped the various moves he showed me very easily. But I knew that it wasn't that I necessarily grasped them easily or that I'm a genius, but I already had a general idea of what swordsmanship should look like. Either way, I didn't let Paul's praise get to my head. I was not a 3-year-old kid, but secretly an adult. And my target of being the strongest was still far off. I expressionlessly continued repeating the sword moves that Paul taught me with focus. My magic is strong, but if possible, eventually mastering all 3 sword styles would also be ideal. At the very least, I have to give it a try and give it my all while I'm young. If I have no talent for battle aura, then so be it. Just knowing how swordsmen fight would be useful enough. After performing various sword drills for a long while, I was then made to strike a sandbag dummy that Paul also prepared in advance. I kept striking at the dummy over and over again while Paul watched over me and pointed out when I was doing something wrong. While Seraphim was training under Paul, Zenith had a conversation with Roxy at the porch while drinking tea. "He's very hardworking, isn't he, Roxy?" Zenith said with a smile. He's a bright and talented boy. I expected him to be more conceited," Roxy said expressionlessly as she also watched the practice. "Right." Zenith smiled. "But Seraph isn't like that. He's an angel." Roxy remained silent whilst her mind wandered. Zenith didn't pay mind to Roxy's absent-minded expression and continued, "He was always like this. Always sincere, charming and hardworking. He's my sunshine. He's amazing, my son. And so cute. My son is the best." Roxy forced a small smile as she saw Zenith looking at Seraphim with some kind of obsession. But she also found it natural. The boy was a prodigy. I guess any parent would dote on their child. She then thought of herself. Were her parents also like that when she was young? Roxy's expression dimmed down. "I don't think so." "Okay, that's enough." Paul announced the end of our training, with a satisfied smile. And at those words, I dropped the wooden sword and plopped my butt on the ground, soaked in sweat and panting. My arms were like rubber. I placed a hand on my chest and silently used intermediate ranked healing magic. Instantly, all of my pain was gone. However, the fatigue and lack of energy remained. Healing magic can remove wounds and muscle pains, but it cannot restore lost stamina. In spite of common sense, even when using healing magic to restore the damage done to the muscles during training, a person would still experience strength and endurance gains normally. But it is not that healing magic makes the restored muscles instantly become stronger. A person would still require time to grow. It is only that post-exercise muscle soreness could be avoided. Based on the principles of hypertrophy back on Earth, you need muscular damage and fatigue to stimulate the growth of muscles. So when you remove the fatigue and through it that stimulus, there is no reason for your muscles to grow. It is the same way when athletes on Earth use ice baths after training. Studies prove that doing this does indeed reduce fatigue and post-exercise muscle soreness, but it simultaneously reduces muscle gains. However, healing magic denies this. I suppose because magic asterisk. It seems to be a more mystical phenomenon. The result of it was that I probably don't need to worry about overtraining and overtaxing my muscles, and I can train to the maximum of my ability to cause the strongest growth stimulus possible. It means I can be more extreme with my strength training, which I did. With healing magic, the phrase, maximum recoverable volume, takes on an entirely different meaning. Utilizing it, I can train with higher intensity and closer to failure, or even always to failure, because I can instantly recover from any abuse. After training, my muscles can instantly recover to baseline, the damage I caused being healed, and already begin growing, speeding up my growth tremendously. However, I am still limited by my ability to recover my energy in the form of glycogen and ATP, and would run out of breath during exercise. In other words, at one point I would simply have no strength to move the weights around or would be limited by my cardio. There should also be a maximum growth stimulus and maximum growth rate that a body can experience, so I'm limited by those. Effectively, there is a kind of maximum effective volume that I aim to do each day for the most optimal growth. Still, compared to a trainee back on Earth, you can train hard and grow very quickly in this world. Theoretically, a person could approach their genetic limit much quicker in the Mushoku world if they utilized healing magic and trained hard, experiencing a rapid transformation. Putting strength training aside, I am not completely sure yet, but I have an idea of the underlying principle behind healing magic. Healing magic in this world is not based on boosting natural recovery or cell duplication, or anything like that, as one might think. Firstly, the body itself does not know what it is supposed to look like as a whole after being healed. When it heals through cell duplication and natural recovery, it never perfectly returns to the previous state, but just kind of tries to patch up the holes. It forms scars as well. Secondly, if healing magic was based on boosting recovery, I should have experienced accelerated strength gains after each training plus healing session, but it is not like this. It also does not improve the rate of stamina recovery, even though it really should. Thirdly, if healing magic enhanced recovery, in other words duplication of cells, it would greatly increase the rate of a person's cellular aging. After all, cells can only duplicate so many times. Once they pass that limit, it is what is called natural death. With considerable wounds being healed over and over in case of warriors, the effect of accelerated aging might have been noted by now. Something like the case of swordsmen having a shorter natural lifespan than normal men, but I haven't heard about anything like this yet. However, I am not entirely sure about this, because people in this world in general seem to die quite early natural deaths, in their 70s. But it is not limited to swordsmen, but it includes magicians and everyone else as well. Putting everything into consideration, I believe that healing magic is all about less than restoring an organism to a perfect healthy state greater than. It is similar to time magic type healing in some novels, except that the time when the wound was caused has limited implications. It is about the conceptual power of bringing the body to a healthy state, like a healing spell in a game restoring the character's health bar back to full. It is more mystical and wondrous than simply boosting recovery. Because of this, I could not simply do 4 sets of push-ups, then heal myself to restore my strength and receive gains through cellular repair recovery, then do another 4 sets, heal myself again, and then keep repeating the process until I max out my genetic potential within weeks. I had thought of this kind of cheating training method before, but it appeared to be impossible. Further supporting my hypothesis, by using healing magic it is also impossible to remove inborn or genetic diseases like poor eyesight. I believe it's because this kind of condition is considered to be the natural state of the body, and healing magic itself is only about restoring the body to that natural, healthy, state, not beyond it. For example, someone like Lilia wears glasses and even advanced or probably saint-ranked healing magic and above would not be able to fix her eyesight. It's a pity though because I personally think she would only look better without glasses. At any rate, healing magic has a mystical power of bringing the body to an ideal healthy condition. Animals and plants can also be affected by healing magic. However, plants would not grow up rapidly, but only be restored to their ideal previous, healthy state. The scene from the anime when Roxy made a tree bloom while healing it could not be replicated in reality. I guess it was just the animators wanting to make the scene look cool. Otherwise it would be possible to grow vegetables and fruits in an instant by flooding the fields with healing magic, or during travel you could plant some seeds in the ground and cast a healing spell to grow some tomatoes, but it was simply not the case. Other than this, a common rule is that more serious injuries can be healed with a higher ranked healing spell, and do it quicker. Simple logic. Even when casting healing magic silently, there still seem to be tears to it. That's all that I know about healing magic that I learned from Zenith. I do not yet have much practice with actually healing people apart from healing small cuts or bruises on myself, but I plan to research it thoroughly in the future. After all, I believe that healing magic at least might be able to offer a solution at extending a person's lifespan and vitality infinitely. As long as healing magic could be applied in conjunction with time magic in a way to restore the body to a state from the past instead of a healthy one, it might be possible. If it has limitations, it could be used repeatedly. Of course, first I would need to study time magic and combine the two, likely in the form of a modified magic circle healing scroll, but this possibility existed. I thought of this while keeping in mind the ancient ruins with information on time magic teleportation to a point in the past that old Rudeus was said to have found. So far, it was my first and main idea to research on my path toward achieving eternal life. It was not an ideal solution, but it was one idea. Right now, Paul was walking back to the house with swagger whilst I was plopped on the ground, restoring my breath. His face was smiling. I guess he was happy that his 3-year-old son, capable of powerful silent magic, was also very enthusiastic about learning the sword. My son is a sword genius. He's going to be a sword king, no, a sword emperor at least. Haha. Paul laughed and bragged while talking to Zenith. I faintly smiled. Well, thanks for training me. I'm not fully just his son, but I'll do what I can. Our wishes aligned. And, a small note. Canonically at 3 years old Rudeus only started his physical training under Paul like squats and push-ups, and we don't quite know when he started swinging the sword. Officially it was only at 5. In contrast, Seraph has already been doing his physical training and was even more skilled in magic, so we can see it as Paul bringing forward his sword training by 2 years. 29 comments 0 vote. Chapter 10. My magic training and gravity magic. After sword training, I dragged my exhausted and sweaty body into the house. Inside, Lilia had already prepared a water basin, a towel and a change of clothes for me in one of the rooms. Like usual. Thank you, Lilia. I smiled gently, then picked up the towel. It's only my duty, young master, she replied expressionlessly, ever professional. But I could see her eyes smiling. In truth, I was a bit indifferent toward Lilia in the anime, but I liked her in this world. It was clear that she deeply cared for me and worked hard to fulfill her duties. She was like a part of the family. I stretched out my hand, then used water and fire magic to quickly fill the empty basin with warm water. In general, people rarely bathe in this world. In our household we had a habit of only doing it once to twice a week. On other days, people would just wipe their bodies with a wet towel. That was all. As for me, I had magic, and also a decent control of it, so it was not a problem to bathe every day. Since I trained physically every day, I always ended up sweaty and sometimes also dirty due to often training outside. I was just a child, bathing was even less troublesome than otherwise. With my body size and the bathtub size I required, it was not a hassle for Lilia to simply prepare a wooden basin for me and then empty it afterwards. Soap existed in this world, but it was greasy and not very user-friendly. The most basic form of soap derived from animal fat, I presume. Because of this I didn't use soap every day, just from time to time. Yet still, I was seen as rather pedantic since I insisted on bathing daily. For this, I just told my parents that I like water. I had to keep in mind that I'm just a 2 to 3-year-old child and usually children view bathing as a hassle. And as a result, they seem to have fully bought it. I took off my clothes fully, then entered the basin to quickly wash myself. By now Lilia learned that I like some privacy, so she had already left the room. She found it funny that I was so shy, but come on. I didn't need anyone to see my little baby elephant trunk if I could help it. She had bathed me before when I was an infant, but that was then and now was now. After taking a quick bath, quick because I'm so hygienic, I thanked Lilia again who had been waiting and began cleaning up after me, then eventually reached my room upstairs. After closing the door, I sat down in a seiza position on the floor in the center of the room, my body straight like a spear. I took in a single large breath, then let it out to concentrate my mind. I then stretched out my hand slightly and faced my palm upwards. It was time for me to begin my training. Explosion. I inwardly activated the less than explosion greater than spell. Then, a small circular red flame the size of a large fist appeared floating above my palm. As I maintained the spell, the red fireball quickly became more uniform and round, and then turned orange, and then finally yellow. This was as far as I was able to get it. Red to orange to yellow. When I first started at 2 years old I was only able to produce red flames. Advancing 2 stages was the result of my training over the last year. At this moment, my flames continued intensifying at the yellow stage into that I have just stepped into. Interestingly, even though I know the advanced rank Exodus Flame, the intermediate ranked Explosion still seemed to be my strongest fire spell. For its good points, less than Exodus Flame greater than, as an advanced spell, can be cast quicker to cause a devastating explosion and affect a huge area. It gathered more total mana quicker to form a massive fireball. However, because the fireball created by it was so massive, I was unable to concentrate the heat as much. In practice, Exodus Flame was devastating when cast on short notice, but Explosion had more potential for destruction with enough time for me to accumulate mana inside it. I believe what I was practicing now was actually the so-called nuclear explosion that Rudeus used against Orsted when he bumped into him for the first time. Simply an overloaded less than explosion greater than spell. After all that Rudeus did at that time in the novel was pour a lot of mana into an unnamed fire spell in the heat of a moment and thoughtlessly fire it at Orsted while imagining the strongest explosion he could. This should be the one spell he used, Explosion. Right now, if I wanted to finalize my spell, the yellow fireball would collapse in on itself and then expand in size, but I didn't do it. Instead, I continued trying to apply more mana and more pressure to the fireball for a few moments, then loosened it a bit, and then resumed attempting to pressurize it even harder again. After doing it for a long while, I dispersed the spell. Trying to train my casting speed, I quickly formulated the explosion spell again and reached the yellow stage as quickly as possible. At one point Lilia brought me a post-workout meal and I quickly wolfed it down, and resumed my training. Then I continued training in the usual manner by trying to concentrate the mana more and more. Since 2 years old I no longer use the method of exhausting my mana through just pouring it out ever since I learned intermediate ranked magic. Wasting my mana this way seemed like a wasted opportunity at practicing my skill when handling real spells instead. I don't think I was losing out in any way, since my mana throughput was also increasing when practicing this way just the same. These days I also experimented a bit with howling magic and had some successes, but I no longer wasted my mana by pouring it out through this pathway either. No matter how I exercised it, I didn't seem to improve this way. I wanted to focus on improving my raw destructive power first and foremost. Compared to casting real magic, howling magic turned out to be just a gimmick. After casting less than explosion greater than like this several times and burning a lot of mana in the process, I focused on another drill. I walked up to the window and opened it. I got on top of a chair, stretched out my hand and focused my aim. Stone cannon. An intermediate ranked earth spell, the original Rudeus' signature single target move. I created a cone-shaped stone bullet, floating near my hand, and tried to make it as dense and hard as possible. Then I added a rotational force to it, ramped up the firing speed as much as possible and then launched it while carefully aiming. I did all of this quickly whilst trying to pack the most mana into it as I could. The stone bullet shot out mysteriously silently, then in an instant struck a stone dummy down below in the garden, shattering parts and bits of it. The speed of this stone bullet was incredibly fast and the result devastating. It was similar to a sniper shot. There wasn't much I was able to do with stone cannon apart from modifying the bullet and overloading it with mana, but that alone seemed to be enough. According to my memory, Rudeus was just the same. I don't remember him using any special tricks, yet his full-powered stone cannon could even shatter demon kings. My bullets takes the most aerodynamic shape I can make, imitating a railgun projectile. I make them dense and pointed. I then also add in a rotation to them, to improve the accuracy more so than improve penetration, as it is with normal bullets. The magic power I put into the spell is still the only driving force behind the bullet's explosive speed. Just that is working well so far. I practice the speed of my spells mainly by using Stone Cannon, which is the best spell for it, probably because the projectile is solid unlike a wind blade or a fireball. After practicing my stone cannons for a good while, using different kinds of bullets and shattering 2 stone dummies below that I created beforehand, I began to do something else. I quickly created several differently shaped rocks and placed them on the wooden floor of my room. Apart from practicing with the common spells, there was also a very special kind of magic that I managed to grasp over the last year. I stretched out my hand and concentrated. I sent out my mana. Then, the rocks started floating upwards as if they became weightless. It was gravity magic. I initially had the impression that gravity magic was a high-level magic that I might only achieve after years of practice, but I was positively surprised. Once I grasped the principle behind it and realized how to use it, it was not as difficult as I thought at all. There were many reasons and tricks that helped me to grasp gravity magic that easily. Firstly, to use gravity magic a person needs to be able to manipulate pure mana. In my eyes, gravity magic is a formless kind of magic just like disrupt magic. Learning how to manipulate pure mana is the first requirement for both. On that note, I have also learned the basics of disrupt magic, how to use your own mana to disrupt the structure of a spell that's being cast. My disrupt magic is not very strong yet, and seems quite chaotic, but I seem to understand how to go about it. In regards to gravity magic, apart from being able to manipulate pure mana, a person also needs to have an idea of how gravity magic is even supposed to work to pull it off. To do it, I relied on my basic physics knowledge from Earth of what gravity really is. I also observed and imitated how objects created by spells float and are then sent flying when cast. For example, stone bullets, icicles and the like. As it turned out, these are all being controlled by gravity magic to stay afloat by negating gravity. I'm not sure if their initial velocity when they're shot out at a target is also the result of gravity magic, but just observing how the spells float was enough to give me a clue. In this world, telekinesis is not the kind of magic that keeps objects in the air and moves them around. It is gravity magic. When you want to make things float, you don't use your mind or mana to lift them up. You mostly negate the gravitational pull of the planet in a certain area, this way the affected objects enter a zero gravity state. When you want to pull a specific item toward you, you wrap it in mana and then affect it with gravitational force, pulling it toward you. Next, things are a bit different when trying to push things away, but you once again manipulate the gravitational force to apply a vector to an object, causing it to be pulled away. It's no wonder that Rudeus failed at telekinesis when he casually tried it during his early years. He had no idea how to go about it, and in the first place he didn't even yet know disrupt magic and how to manipulate pure mana. For me, once I had a general plan of action in mind, I was able to naturally grasp gravity magic relatively easily once I began experimenting. Relying on Einstein's theory of general relativity made it even easier to imagine the process. I think the fact that I'm very young also played a role. As it seems, the younger you are, the easier it is to learn magic in this world. It's similar to how learning silent casting is effortless for a child, but adults require enormous effort and skill to pull it off. If you ask anyone in this world, silent casting is a very high-level technique that only master magicians can use. But is it really? Once a child knows how to do it, they can learn it easily. With this in mind, it might not be shocking that I grasped gravity magic before 3 years old, but instead being so young is what made it easier. I've been training with this special magic for over 6 months already. My current ability wasn't yet enough to make gravity magic my trump card in combat, but I was working on it every day, improving my range and the force of gravity. To become a master of gravity magic. In the future I can make gravity magic my ultimate move and my speciality. By practicing from a young age, I'll be the strongest gravity magic user to ever exist. Zero gravity field, high gravity field, telekinesis, space-time manipulation. All of these might be possible. I'm excited. Next chapter. Enjoy this book so far. Sign in.